The Pentarch Collective prided itself on approximately 47,000 different accomplishments, ranging from the invention of faster-than-light travel to the development of universal translation matrices. But if you asked any member of their administrative caste what they were most proud of, they'd tell you about the evaluation protocol. This magnificent system, refined over 3 centuries, determined which species were truly worthy of joining the greater galactic community. Not through warfare, mind you. The galaxy had seen enough of that nonsense during the Krell expansion. No, the Pentarch Collective believed in testing a species' fundamental capabilities, their ability to adapt, to survive, to prove they weren't just technologically lucky primitives who'd stumbled onto antimatter by accident. The Wilderness Survival Evaluation was the crown jewel of this system. Conducted on Verdaxis 7, a planet so ecologically diverse it made Earth look like a parking lot, the test was brutally simple: survive 30 rotations using only the natural resources available. No technology beyond basic clothing, no outside food, no communication devices. Just you, the wilderness, and your species' supposedly superior evolutionary advantages. In 300 cycles of testing, exactly 0 species had passed. The Krillians, with their vaunted crystalline intellect, had poisoned themselves within 6 rotations. The Voth Confederacy, master shipbuilders and engineering prodigies, had starved while sitting next to perfectly edible tubers because they couldn't identify them. The Zenari, those philosophical giants who'd written treatises on the nature of existence itself, had simply refused to eat primitive vegetation and had to be evacuated on rotation 9 when they started hallucinating about their ancestors judging them. The test wasn't supposed to be passed. That was the point, actually. It was designed to humble species, to remind them that for all their technological achievements, they'd become soft, dependent, divorced from the fundamental skills that had allowed their ancestors to survive long enough to build civilizations in the first place. Species that failed the test, all of them were inducted into the collective with a healthy dose of humility and a profound appreciation for modern conveniences. Then the humans arrived. Evaluator Kix Tornal, a being composed of what could generously be described as geometric anxiety given form, watched the human delegation disembark with the same tepid interest he'd afforded the previous 200 species. They looked unremarkable. Bipedal, which was common enough. Soft-skinned, which seemed like a design flaw. Their eyes moved independently of each other, which was frankly unnerving, but nothing he hadn't seen before. Their leader, a woman who'd introduced herself with a name containing an improbable number of syllables that the translator rendered as Chen Rodriguez, smiled with an expression Kix Tornal's cultural database labeled as either friendly or about to sell you something you don't need. The Verdaxis 7 evaluation, Kix Tornal intoned, his vocalization crystals humming with bureaucratic authority, has never been completed successfully. It is designed to test your species' fundamental adaptive capabilities. You will be provided with basic clothing appropriate to the climate zones. You will have access to nothing else. Survive for 30 rotations, and humanity will be welcomed into the collective with honors. Cool, Chen Rodriguez said, which the translator struggled with before settling on acknowledged with enthusiasm. Quick question. Are we allowed to eat the plants? Kix Tornal's geometric angles shifted in what might have been confusion. The plants are present. Whether they are edible is for you to determine. That is the nature of the test. Right, but we can eat them, like there's no rule against it. There are no restrictions on what you consume, provided you obtain it from the natural environment. Awesome. Chen Rodriguez turned to her team, a collection of humans who appeared to range from young and enthusiastic to old and somehow more enthusiastic. Everybody hear that? Plants are on the menu. One of the older humans, his facial fur almost entirely white, raised his appendage. "What about fungi? Technically not plants, but Martinez, if it's growing out of the ground and it doesn't run away, it's fair game." Keith Thornell decided he didn't understand human classification systems and didn't particularly want to. The deployment proceeded normally. 20 humans, scattered across 4 different biomes on Verdaxis 7, forests, grasslands, coastal regions, and wetlands. Each environment offered potential food sources. Each environment also offered approximately 7 dozen ways to poison yourself if you didn't know what you were doing. The other species deployed alongside the humans followed predictable patterns. The Hexorians immediately began constructing elaborate shelters, wasting precious energy on architecture rather than sustenance. The Millian delegation spent their first rotation attempting to establish a democratic process for deciding who would search for food, which went about as well as any committee decision-making process in the history of the universe. The humans, monitored by remote observation drones, did something unprecedented. They walked around and looked at stuff. Not aimlessly, mind you, though for the first 2 rotations that's exactly what it appeared to be. They picked up plants, smelled them, took small samples of leaves, made scratches on rocks to apparently keep track of things. One human spent an entire rotation cataloging different types of grasses, which seemed like the behavior of someone who'd already given up and decided to pursue a hobby instead. By rotation 4, the Hexorians were getting desperate, attempting to eat bark. The Millian were still debating, though 3 had broken off to form a splinter group that argued for eating grass based on color analysis. Their theory was incorrect, and they spent rotation 5 experiencing what the medical drones termed significant gastric distress. The humans, meanwhile, had started making piles. Keith Thornell watched through the observation feeds, his geometric confusion intensifying. The humans had established what appeared to be collection points. Plants were sorted into different categories, though the classification system made no sense. Some piles were larger than others. The humans kept returning to certain areas, harvesting specific plants while ignoring others that appeared identical to Keith Thornell's sensors. "What are they doing?" his assistant evaluator Preen asked. Preen was a Voth, and she still had nightmares about her species' failed evaluation 7 cycles prior. "I believe," Keith Thornell said slowly, "they are organizing." On rotation 6, the first breakthrough occurred. A human named Jackson, deployed in the coastal region, did something that made every evaluator watching simultaneously experience what humans would call sympathetic nausea. He took a plant, chewed a small portion of it, waited approximately 1/20th of a rotation, then consumed more. The plant was, according to Verdaxis 7's botanical database, mildly toxic to most carbon-based life forms. Jackson experienced mild discomfort, documented it with scratches on a rock, and moved on to test another plant. "He's poisoning himself," Preen whispered, her vocalization membrane quivering with horror. "No," Keith Thornell said, his sensors focused on Jackson's vital signs. "He's testing small doses. He's determining toxicity levels through experimentation." "That's insane. That's effective." By rotation 8, the pattern had become undeniable. Every human team had established sophisticated classification systems. They'd identified approximately 60% of edible plants in their respective biomes through a combination of observation, pattern recognition, and what appeared to be a willingness to experience moderate poisoning in the name of data collection. The humans had started calling it the taste test protocol, which sounded much more official than eating random things and hoping for the best. But it worked. More disturbingly, they'd started preserving food. The coastal team had discovered that certain seaweeds could be dried in the sun and stored for later consumption. The forest team had found tubers that remained edible for multiple rotations if kept in cool, dark places. The grassland team had identified seeds that could be ground between rocks and mixed with water to create a nutritionally dense paste that looked revolting but apparently tasted like freedom, according to one human's enthusiastic assessment. The wetland team had somehow created fermented vegetation that produced a mildly alcoholic beverage, which seemed unnecessary but very on-brand for a species that had apparently never met a fermentation process they didn't want to experiment with. By rotation 12, the other species had completely failed. The Hexorians were evacuated after attempting to eat what they thought was fruit, but was actually a parasitic egg cluster. The Million had finally agreed on a food strategy, then immediately split into two factions arguing about implementation. They were withdrawn on rotation 13, still arguing. The humans were thriving. Kix Thornell watched human Chen Rodriguez survey her team's food stores with what the emotional analysis software labeled as pride and mild smugness. They'd accumulated enough preserved rations to last another 30 rotations easily. Her team had mapped every edible plant within a 2-kilometer radius, created a rotation schedule for harvesting to prevent overexploitation, and had apparently started experimenting with crude agriculture by replanting certain high-yield specimens in easily accessible locations. "They're farming," Preen said, her vocalization carrying notes of disbelief. "They've been here 12 rotations, and they're already farming." The test parameters didn't prohibit cultivation, Kix Thornell noted, though he was frantically checking the regulations to confirm this. On rotation 15, something remarkable happened. The grassland team made contact with a struggling Hexorian scout who'd somehow avoided evacuation and was attempting to survive on what appeared to be pure stubbornness and denial. The human team, led by the elderly Martinez, didn't just share food with the Hexorian. They taught him which plants were safe, how to identify edible roots, and gave him preserved rations to sustain him while he learned. The Hexorian, whose name translated to something like Crystalline Thought Formation 7, broke down in tears of gratitude that physically interfered with his crystalline structure and required medical intervention anyway. But the gesture remained. The observation drones captured Martinez sitting with the Hexorian, patiently explaining the difference between similar-looking root vegetables. One would provide sustenance for days, the other would cause hallucinogenic episodes and respiratory distress. The fact that they grew within meters of each other seemed like a cosmic joke, but Martinez treated it as a teaching opportunity. "See these leaves?" Martinez's voice came through the drone's audio sensors. 5 points versus 7. That's your first indicator. Now smell them. Different, right? The safe one has almost no scent. The dangerous one smells faintly sweet. That sweetness is your warning. Nature often advertises poison. You just have to know what to look for. Crystalline Thought Formation 7 absorbed this information with what appeared to be religious reverence. Your species simply knows this. This knowledge is common. Well, somebody had to learn it the hard way first. Probably several somebodies. Then they taught others. Who taught others? And eventually you get a collective understanding of what'll feed you versus what'll kill you. We write it down, teach it in schools, pass it along. Some knowledge is too important to lose. Kix Thornell convened an emergency meeting of the Evaluation Committee on Rotation 18. The humans had not only survived, they'd essentially established sustainable food systems in 4 different biomes. They were, if anything, gaining weight. Martinez had been observed whistling, which the database indicated was a sound humans made when experiencing contentment. We need to extend the evaluation, Committee Head Vex Norrell announced, her bioluminescent patches flickering with determination. Clearly 30 rotations is insufficient. We'll extend to 60. They have enough stored food for 60 rotations, Kix Thornell noted. Then 90. They're showing no signs of resource depletion. If anything, their systems are becoming more efficient. The coastal team has developed what appears to be a functional preservation technique using salt. The forest team is smoking meats from small fauna they've trapped. They're eating animals now. Vex Norrell's patches flared with something that might have been respect or horror, or possibly both. They've always been eating animals. Or rather, they've been setting traps, catching small fauna, and preserving the meat using techniques they apparently developed approximately 10,000 of their years ago. According to their cultural database, this is considered a basic survival skill taught to their young. The committee sat in silence, processing this information. What kind of species, Preen asked quietly, teaches their children how to survive without technology as a baseline educational component? One that apparently remembers where it came from, Kix Thornell said. Another committee member, a Zenari named Philosophic Questioning Voice, interjected with what his species considered profound insight. Perhaps we have been evaluating survival incorrectly. We assumed technological species would lose primitive skills. Humans seem to have codified those skills, transformed survival knowledge into cultural heritage. They have organizations, Kix Thornell added, pulling up human database entries, entire institutions dedicated to wilderness survival, botanical identification, and what they call bushcraft. They have competitions where participants are judged on their ability to survive with minimal equipment. They have literature, educational programs, recreational activities, all centered around these skills. Recreational, Vex Norrell repeated, her patches cycling through colors associated with confusion. They intentionally place themselves in survival situations for enjoyment. Apparently it builds what they call character and self-reliance. Also, according to this entry, it's considered an excellent way to disconnect from the stress of modern life by reconnecting with fundamental human capabilities. The decision was made to end the evaluation early, not because the humans were failing, but because they were succeeding so thoroughly that continuing the test served no purpose except to provide them with an extended camping vacation, which they seemed to be enjoying immensely. When informed the test was ending, the forest team actually expressed disappointment. They'd apparently been planning to attempt beekeeping with a local insect species that produced a honey-like substance. The wetland team had been documenting fish migration patterns and had developed what they called pretty decent fishing techniques using woven plant fibers and sharpened sticks. Chen Rodriguez stood before the evaluation committee on rotation 23, looking significantly healthier than when she'd arrived. Her skin had darkened from sun exposure, her muscle tone had improved, and she radiated the satisfaction of someone who'd just proven a point without having to explicitly state it. "Explain," Vex Norrell demanded, her patches cycling through colors associated with confusion and academic curiosity. "Your species has accomplished what no other has managed in 3 centuries of testing. We must understand your methodology." Chen Rodriguez shrugged, a gesture the translator interpreted as dismissive acknowledgement of achievement. "We foraged. It's kind of what we do. You did significantly more than forage. You developed classification systems, preservation techniques, sustainable harvesting practices, and rudimentary agriculture in less than 30 rotations." "Right, but that's all part of foraging. You can't just grab random plants and hope for the best." "Well, I mean you can, but that's how you end up poisoned or dead. Usually both." Our ancestors spent thousands of years figuring out what was safe to eat, how to prepare it, how to store it. We've got basically the entire history of human agriculture encoded in our collective knowledge. This test was just applying skills we already had. Kixthornal's geometric angles shifted into what might have been comprehension. You're saying your species never lost this knowledge. Despite achieving space travel, artificial intelligence and quantum computing, you still teach wilderness survival. Of course we do. Technology fails, ships crash, systems malfunction. If you don't know how to keep yourself alive with just what's around you, you're one equipment failure away from extinction. Plus, you know, camping is fun. Lots of humans do this recreationally. Recreationally, Vexnoral repeated, her voice flat. Yeah, we call it hiking or camping or backpacking. Some humans spend their entire vacation time deliberately going to remote locations and surviving off the land. There are competitions, television programs, entire subcultures built around wilderness survival skills. We have people who can identify hundreds of edible plants just by looking at them, people who can start fires without modern tools, build shelters from natural materials, track animals, predict weather patterns. It's all part of our cultural knowledge base. Preen made a sound like a dying atmospheric regulator. You do this for entertainment. Some of us do. Others do it because they like understanding how things work at a fundamental level. You can't really appreciate agricultural technology until you've tried growing food with your bare hands. Makes you grateful for fertilizer and irrigation systems. Let me tell you, Martinez, who'd accompanied Chen Rodriguez to the committee hearing, raised his appendage again. If I may, there's also a philosophical component. Humans have this concept that knowing where your food comes from, understanding the natural processes that sustain life, keeps you connected to something essential. We got really good at technology, sure, but we remembered that before we had technology, we had ingenuity, observation, and a willingness to try things that might kill us in the pursuit of not starving. The taste test protocol, Kixthornal said. Exactly. Is this plant poisonous? Well, let's find out. Start with a tiny amount. Wait. See what happens. Adjust accordingly. Document everything. Share information. That's how humans built botanical knowledge, through trial, error, and occasionally significant gastric distress. We have historical records of people who dedicated their lives to cataloging edible plants. Some died in the process. We remember them as heroes of scientific inquiry. Your species' approach to survival appears to be systematic poisoning, followed by data analysis. When you say it like that, it sounds bad, Chen Rodriguez admitted. But yeah, basically, though we prefer to call it empirical testing with acceptable risk parameters, the key is controlling the risk. Small doses, careful observation, multiple test subjects when possible. You build knowledge incrementally, and eventually you have comprehensive understanding. Jackson, the coastal team member who'd first demonstrated the taste test protocol, spoke up from where he stood with the other human delegates. I grew up learning this stuff from my grandfather. He could walk through a forest and point out 50 different edible plants, explain how to prepare each one, which parts were safe, which seasons were best for harvesting. That knowledge kept our ancestors alive for millennia. Why would we abandon it just because we developed better technology? The committee conferred briefly, their various communication methods creating a cacophony of sounds, lights, and pheromones that the universal translator wisely didn't attempt to render into coherent speech. Finally, Vexnoral addressed the humans directly. Humanity has passed the Verdaxis 7 evaluation. You are the first species to do so. This is either a tremendous achievement or a damning indictment of our testing methodology? Possibly both. We'll take it as an achievement, Chen Rodriguez said cheerfully. There is, however, a complication. The Hexaurian Crystalline Thought Formation 7 has submitted a formal request for humanity to establish wilderness survival training programs for species within the collective. He claims you taught him more about survival in one rotation than his species' entire educational system covered in a lifetime. We have received similar requests from 17 other species who observed your performance. Martinez grinned, an expression that showed far too many teeth to be entirely comfortable for species unfamiliar with human facial configurations. We'd be happy to teach. Though I should warn you, our teaching methodology involves a lot of the same trial and error we used to learn. We're not just going to tell you what's safe to eat. We're going to teach you how to figure it out yourself. That sounds, Preen said carefully, terrifying. It's really not that bad, Chen Rodriguez assured her. We've only had 3 fatalities in the past century from foraging accidents, and 2 of those involved people deliberately ignoring safety protocols to win bets. Which, admittedly, is very human, but not recommended for species still learning the basics. That doesn't inspire confidence. Look, here's the thing about humans. We're curious, we're adaptable, and we have a really high tolerance for risk when the potential reward is knowledge or food, preferably both. Our ancestors didn't have databases or sensors or chemical analyzers. They had observation, pattern recognition, and the willingness to occasionally feel really sick in the pursuit of science. That's how we learned which mushrooms were delicious and which ones made you see your ancestors. Some mushrooms do both, Martinez added helpfully, but those are generally considered recreational rather than nutritional. Different category entirely. We can cover that in advanced classes. The evaluation committee ultimately accepted the human offer to establish training programs, though they implemented strict safety protocols and medical oversight. Within 2 cycles, human wilderness survival courses became the most popular voluntary education program in the collective, despite having a reputation for involving more risk and discomfort than most species considered appropriate for learning experiences. The waiting list exceeded 10,000 participants within the first cycle. Kikast Thornell attended one of the early sessions, watching Martinez teach a mixed species class about edible plant identification. The old human held up a plant with serrated leaves and purple flowers. Now, this particular specimen is toxic to most carbon-based life forms in its raw state. But if you process it correctly, remove these specific parts, boil it twice, drain the water both times, it becomes not only edible, but actually quite nutritious. How did humans learn this? Through a combination of desperate hunger, careful observation of which animals ate it and survived, and probably at least one very sick ancestor who became a cautionary tale. That's the human approach. Nothing is impossible, everything is potential food, and the difference between poison and nutrition is often just preparation. A Krillian student raised a crystalline appendage, but how do you know if you've prepared it correctly? Martinez's grin widened. Well, that's where the empirical testing comes in. Start with a very small amount. Wait a full rotation. Monitor your physical responses. If nothing bad happens, try a slightly larger amount. Document everything. This is why we always recommend having multiple people test independently. More data points, better conclusions, and always have medical support available for the learning process. The students' crystalline structure dimmed with horror, but they leaned forward, fascinated despite themselves. Chen Rodriguez, observing from the back of the classroom, caught Kikast Thornell's attention. You know what the funny thing is? Most humans never actually need these skills. We have agriculture, food distribution systems, restaurants, grocery stores. The vast majority of us will never face a survival situation. But we teach it anyway, because knowledge shouldn't die just because it's not immediately useful. You never know when you'll need to identify edible tubers in a crisis. Do you expect frequent crises requiring tuber identification? Kikast Thornell asked. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. That's kind of our species' motto. Well, one of them. We have several. 3 cycles after humanity's successful evaluation, the Pentarch Collective quietly reformed their testing protocols. The Verdaxis 7 evaluation was modified to include a comprehensive botanical database and chemical analyzers, not because humans had proven the test unfair, but because humans had proven that expecting other species to match their particular combination of curiosity, risk tolerance, and systematic approach to potential poisoning was unrealistic. The test still humbled species, just differently now. And somewhere on Verdaxis 7, automated monitoring systems occasionally detected human heat signatures. Investigation revealed groups of humans had started using the planet as a destination for what they called extreme wilderness camping experiences. They paid substantial fees for the privilege of being dropped into the same environments that had defeated 3 centuries worth of alien species, armed with nothing but basic clothing and what one human described as really good pattern recognition and a semi-functional survival instinct. When questioned about this, Chen Rodriguez, now serving as humanity's ambassador to the collective, simply smiled that unsettling human smile. What can I say? We like to know where our food comes from. Plus, the challenge keeps us sharp. Can't let ourselves get too comfortable with technology. Never know when you'll need to identify edible tubers in a crisis. Besides, Verdaxis 7 has some really interesting flora we're still cataloging. The coastal regions have these seaweeds that, when properly fermented, produce the most amazing umami flavor profile. We're thinking of establishing sustainable harvesting operations, with proper environmental oversight, of course. Kix Thornell, having learned more about humans than he'd ever intended, didn't bother asking why they expected crises requiring tuber identification or why they wanted to ferment alien seaweed. With humans, it was apparently better not to know. The species that had systematically poisoned themselves into agricultural expertise had joined the galactic community. The collective was still determining whether this was cause for celebration or concern, probably both. But at least they'd never go hungry, and perhaps more importantly, neither would anyone else who had the courage or desperation to take their classes.